10 months, everybody. In just 10 months, we're finally gonna get our hands on Cyberpunk, CD Projekt Red's next epic release. It's kind of crazy to think about. I remember watching the teaser trailer from 2013, and ever since then, I have been so hyped, and it seemed like it would never come. And here we are. We can see some gameplay online now. There's new gameplay coming out in August, and April 2020, it launches. Now, as we near Cyberpunk 2077's launch, one question that's on a lot of people's minds is how big is the game? I tried to ask the question of how long it will take to complete the campaign during my interview with CD Projekt Red from E3 2019, but they basically said that it's a question they can't really answer with certainty because, first of all, the game isn't finished yet. They're still adding or removing content. And also there's the fact that it really depends on your play style. If you're more of like beeline straight through, shoot everything up, maybe it'll take less than someone who might take a more methodical and stealthy approach. Now, one way some people like to gauge the size of a game is, well, by the file size of a title, how many gigabytes it takes up of your hard drive. It tends to be that when a game takes up a huge portion of your hard drive, it's a pretty damn big game, especially when we're dealing with open world RPGs. That's not always the case, mind you. Sometimes it's just poor optimization, poor compression job, or just, uncompressed audio sometimes takes up a lot of space, even when the overall scale of a project tends to be relatively small. So, there are a lot of varying factors on that front. But at the same time, when a AAA open world RPG comes out and the file size is big, it does inform a bit. It doesn't mean nothing. So enter Cyberpunk 2077. This game definitely looks to be the largest and most ambitious game CD Projekt Red has produced yet. They're definitely pulling all stops. They're trying to surpass Witcher 3 on all fronts, and it shows. Now, as it turns out, there is some hint out there right now in regards to how big Cyberpunk's file size might be. This information comes from European PlayStation Store sites. So if you look at this page right here and scroll down, there is some information here that states that people will require, at the very least, a whopping 80 gigabytes of disk space in order to be able to download and play the title. Yeah, that's a pretty big game right there. Just for context, Witcher 3, the base game by itself, was like 30 to 35 gigabytes, and then if you added all the DLCs and expansions on top of that, you'd be looking at 51 gigabytes worth of hard drive space. So Cyberpunk 2077, based on what we're seeing here, could be a little over double Witcher 3's base game, and then Witcher 3 with all the DLC added, Cyberpunk 2077 surpasses that by about a little less than double. And of course, Witcher 3 was a pretty massive game, tons of content, beautiful to look at, so on and so forth. So I can only imagine what all this extra hard drive space will contribute in terms of the scale of Cyberpunk 2077. It's pretty exciting stuff. Do keep in mind, however, that game development technology is becoming more and more advanced with every passing year. So that just means in general, games as a whole are going to become bigger and bigger, AAA titles in particular. But I'll say this, even by today's standards, Cyberpunk 2077 is definitely on the higher end of the spectrum. It isn't the biggest game ever by any means. You've got games like Red Dead Redemption 2, which I believe launched with a disk drive requirement of around 100 gigabytes. I think a little more than that, maybe 105 gigabytes. Do keep in mind, however, that how big a game's file size is doesn't necessarily equate to how long you're going to be playing a game. So just because Cyberpunk 2077's file size might end up being a little over twice as big as Witcher 3, the base game, doesn't mean that it'll be a little over twice as long than that title. So Witcher 3's campaign took on average about 50 hours to beat. It could take 100 if you did a lot of side quests. It could last even longer if you were a completionist and tried to 100% the game. So we cannot interpret this 80 gigabyte file size as meaning that the campaign will probably be like 100 hours long and 200 hours if you do all the various side quests and 300 hours if you are a completionist. it doesn't scale that way. Much of that increase in file size probably has more to do with the fact that they're using higher fidelity assets, so models are higher resolution now, textures are higher resolution, there's probably a lot of audio going on in this game, there's just a whole lot of sound effects and little details going on when it comes to audio. There's probably going to be a lot of dialogue, given this is a massive RPG with a lot of branching paths and narrative direction. CD Projekt Red is using a brand new engine for Cyberpunk, so they're using Red Engine 4, I believe, whereas Witcher 3 used Red Engine 3. So just in general, higher fidelity, more files and gigabytes needed to bring this world to life with the fidelity that they want. If you ask me, all that's what's ultimately contributing to such a huge jump in file size. I suspect that Cyberpunk 2077, in terms of campaign length, will be about the same as Witcher 3. I suspect they're not going to veer off too far from that. I know for a fact that CD Projekt Red won't skim on content. They're not that kind of studio. They're shoving and cramming in as many quests and as much content as possible in the base game. And hey, while 80 gigabytes doesn't inform us directly about how many hours the campaign might take to beat and stuff like that, the fact that it is minimum 80 gigabytes already tells us at the very least that it's definitely not a small game, that it's not going to be some meager RPG where you just play like 10 hours. It's going to be an extensive experience, and, you know, this is CD Projekt Red. They're known for those types of games. At the same time, though, do keep in mind that this hard drive space requirement isn't finalized. Obviously, CD Projekt Red, they're still working on the game, so there's no way they can tell for sure right now how big the game's going to be. They're still adding, removing content, tweaking stuff here and there. And furthermore, a Reddit user pointed out that a Cyberpunk developer took to Discord to address this, and apparently they said that this is indeed a placeholder requirement and that things could change as development goes along. What they said was that disk space requirement could turn out to be more, or it could turn out to be less than what is listed here. So definitely don't take 80 gigabytes as definite, as set in stone, but it certainly doesn't sound like an impossibility. And not to mention that somebody at CD Projekt Red probably had to come up with this estimate. They were probably asked to give some kind of estimate to put up on the PlayStation Store in the meantime. So their best guess at that time was like minimum 80 gigabytes. Somebody came up with that number. It wasn't an error, given that it's still listed on the storefront. I think they would have removed it if they thought that the information was completely erroneous. So there's some validity there. It is some kind of estimate. So I suppose what this all indicates in terms of breadth of content remains to be seen. We don't know if the campaign will be longer than Witcher 3's or shorter. We don't know how many side quests Cyberpunk 2077 has compared to Witcher 3, but this still indicates a pretty damn sizable RPG. If I were you, I'd personally set aside like 100 gigabytes, reserve that much disk space for the game just in case. So for those with PS4s and Xbox Ones, those consoles, I believe they tend to come with 1 terabyte. That's a tenth of your storage right there. Yeah, it's a lot. Or you could save up a little bit of money and try to buy an external USB drive, or if you already have that, then you're probably all set. I should also mention that CD Projekt Red has confirmed that they're releasing bite-sized free DLCs and large expansions, paid expansions. So basically they're following the Witcher 3 model. That means that down the line, we can expect that the game will grow in file size, probably by like 20 to 40 gigabytes per expansion, depending on how large they are. And, you know, given that they're using a new engine to make this game and everything takes up more disk space, the DLCs and expansions are also bound to take up a lot more space. So, you know, we could be looking at 100, 120 gigabytes total once this Cyberpunk package is fully complete with every bit of extra content. And then there's, of course, patches. They tend to be actually pretty sizable these days. They can range from a couple gigabytes to like a dozen or 2 gigabytes. Day one patches can be pretty huge from time to time. So things to keep in mind. I'd imagine that, you know, 2-3 years from now, games that are 80 gigabytes in size won't be too uncommon. I remember back when games got up to like 40 gigabytes, and I thought that was insane. Now 40 gigabytes is nothing. It's kind of the standard. You know, 30, 40, 50 gigabytes, that range is what AAA games tend to ship as in terms of file size. And 80 gigabytes is definitely on the upper end now, but a couple years down the line, 80 gigabytes will be standard, and we'll start seeing, you know, 120, 150 gigabyte games. And, we'll probably see those as pretty crazy, but then as years advance, that could become standardized. And that's just kind of the ebb and flow of computer technology, I suppose. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked here. As a PC player, I do hope to find out what the system requirements are soon. So beyond the hard drive stuff, I'd like to know what CPU I'd have to use, what GPU is recommended. Now, if you search for system requirements right now, you're going to be greeted by a website like this, which states that the minimum requirement is an i7-8700K and a GTX 1080 Ti graphics card. This is complete BS. This right here isn't the minimum requirements. It's the specs that CD Projekt Red used to run the E3 2018 demo build from way back when. So yeah, if you have a 1080 Ti or similar GPU or an 8700K CPU or similar, you're probably going to be able to run the game pretty smoothly. So there's some information there. From what I saw in that E3 2018 demo with those specs, despite this being a less optimized sort of earlier build, it ran pretty smoothly. So I imagine that the final game, with all the optimizations in place, this kind of hardware spec will be plenty enough for most people, at 1080p especially. But in terms of official system requirements, CD Projekt Red hasn't released them yet because, again, the game isn't done yet. It's still like 10 months out. They have plenty of time to tweak things and really define what the system requirements are and finalize things so they know for sure how big this game's going to be in terms of file size and put that information out there once they feel like it's more finalized and accurate. Until we get that information, though, I'd love to hear what your take is on all of this. How big do you think Cyberpunk 2077 is going to be? Do you think that the 80 gigabytes assessment could be pretty accurate? Do you expect the game to be bigger than that? Smaller than that? Let us know in the comments below. And to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.